Beginning with this chapter, Chapter 5, we're going to start to examine some theoretical explanations for homicide. Chapter 5 looks at both biological and psychological explanations for homicide. So early explanations of all crime, but also, of course, in particular homicide, are supernatural in nature. So someone is either possessed by a demon or the person is evil. And some of this still exists today when we try to explain crime, especially in popular culture. We'll often hear people refer to someone as evil. So positivism is the first school of thought, and recall that, well, it's not the first school of thought, sorry. Recall that the classical school of thought says that offenders make rational decisions, right? So all crime results from free will. We sit down, we don't really sit down, but we sort of roughly calculate the costs and benefits of committing a particular offense and make a rational decision whether or not to commit a crime. So we basically weigh the pros and cons and act in our own best interest. As an alternative to this, positivism develops in the 18th century. And positivism is a larger school of thought, and then within that school of thought are several other theories. This basically says human behavior is influenced by factors that we cannot control. So when people say things like poverty causes crime, that's a positivist argument. So biological theories. Again, early on, biological theories are really, they're not very scientifically sound, and most of them have been proven wrong. But Cesar Lombroso in 1876 writes The Criminal Man, and it's an essay where he explains how he believes biology can account for offending. He was a professor of psychiatry and anthropology, and what he did was he performed some post-mortem examinations of convicts. And then he based his understanding on what's called physiognomy. This is the study of physical appearance and behavior, and phrenology, which is the study of the shape of your skull. Lombroso found numerous anomalies in face, skeleton, and other functions and features in these convicts that he examined. So he found things like asymmetrical faces, flat noses, protruding jaws and long arms. And at the time, he's really influenced by Darwin. Recall that Darwin is talking about evolution, and he's talking about survival of the fittest. So basically, Lombroso thought then that our criminal tendencies were atavistic in nature. Atavistic means ape-like. And so what he did was he talked about criminals as being atavistic throwbacks. These are basically people who haven't fully evolved, okay? So they're biological throwbacks to an earlier evolutionary stage. They're more primitive, they're less evolved, and that's why they engage in criminal behavior. Lombroso categorized offenders into three categories: born criminals, which is what he talks about the most, and these are the atavistic throwbacks. Essentially, if you had 5 or more atavistic features, you were considered a born criminal. Insane criminals were idiots or imbeciles who had low intelligence and committed cruel, impulsive, and obscene acts. And criminaloids were people who were not mentally ill, but under the right conditions could commit crimes of passion, including homicide. He had 2 students who expanded upon his ideas, Garofalo and Ferry. Ferry looked at the insane, born, occasional, habitual, and passionate criminal, and Garofalo focused more on psychology. He looked at murderers, violent criminals, criminals deficient in probity, and lascivious criminals. Lombroso's work and his students has largely been discredited. First of all, it's not very objective, and he's using a biased sample. If all you're doing is studying actual known offenders, your sample is going to be biased. You can't take that sample and then try to generalize it to a larger population. In 1931, Goring refuted that connection between physical appearance, physical features, and offending. He compared 3,000 English prisoners to a control group and found no support for atavism. But some remnants of this still remain. You guys might remember maybe a year or two ago, there was a story on Facebook about this very attractive offender. And so the public is often surprised when attractive people commit heinous crimes. We sort of expect criminals to look differently and to not be attractive. Sheldon, about 75 years later, looks after, classifies offenders by body type. And he basically studied juvenile offenders in Boston, and he categorized them according to what he called somatotypes, which are body types. Endomorphs look a little bit more like Santa Claus. Ectomorphs are thin and fragile. If you're familiar with the cartoon Popeye, it's more like olive oil. And mesomorphs are muscular and athletic. And he determined that mesomorphs were more likely to be criminals. If you think about this from a logical standpoint, especially if we're talking about homicide or violent offenses, It makes sense that someone who is more muscular and athletic might be more violent because they would be more successful at it. Again, these theories have been largely disproved, and largely a lot of the biological theories have been avoided because of their policy implications. So if what causes someone to commit crime is something about their body type, then how do we prevent that? Well, we would sterilize people, we would allow them not to reproduce. And so eugenics is considered unethical. Other studies have looked at heredity. How do your genes influence you? And some people have done these studies of criminal families. So in 1877, Dugdale studied the Jukes. This is a family that was imprisoned in a New York County jail. And he traced their family tree and found a great number of the family had been imprisoned over the past 20 years. In 1912, Goddard collected data on the Kallikaks and compared descendants of Martin, who fathered children with his upstanding moral wife, and then also fathered children with his, quote, moronic mistress. The children that were products of the affair tended to be criminals and alcoholics. And so basically the argument here was that their feeble-mindedness and criminality were results of genetics. But we also want to think about the role that family plays. And when you look at both of these families, it's much more likely that their social environment and their learning environment played a bigger role. Fox Butterfield, who is a journalist, has written about two families who appear to be passing criminal behavior on through the generations. So in his book, All God's Children, he looked at a family where the male children were consistently in trouble with the police. And he also looked at Dale Vincent Bogle, who had 28 family members who'd been convicted of crimes. In 1991, the DOJ surveyed state prison inmates and found that over a third of them had immediate family members who'd been incarcerated. So again, while some people use this to point to genetics, it really could be more about the environment in which you're raised, or it could be a combination of both factors. Other people have studied twins, and they've compared monozygotic and dizygotic twins. So monozygotic is one egg. This is where identical twins come from. One egg splits into two. And dizygotic twins are two eggs get fertilized at the same time. Since twins that are raised together share a common environment, this could potentially allow us to look at how genetics plays a role. So what these studies often do is look at concordance rates. They look at a measure that reflects the proportion or percentage of twin pairs in which both twins had a particular trait in common. And here what they're looking at is whether or not they're offenders. So if there are more concordance rates amongst identical twins, then maybe genetics are playing a role. So one researcher, Lang, studied 30 pairs of twins and found that indeed the identical twins had nearly 77% concordance rate. Things to keep in mind, though, 30 pairs of twins is a really small sample. Larger studies have showed less concordance. So a meta-analysis, this is where somebody goes back and analyzes all the research on a particular topic, found that the concordance rate for identical twins was closer to 52%. One thing that may be playing a role here is, are identical twins treated more similarly than fraternal twins because they look alike? We also want to remember that just because someone might be predisposed to something doesn't mean they will absolutely definitely do that thing or become that thing. So what could be necessary is the right environmental conditions. Adoption studies have tried to also sort of take a similar approach to twin studies. So if we could compare somebody's biological parent with the environment that they have when they're raised by an adoptive parent, we would expect children to be more similar to their adoptive parents if environment is more important. Adopted children tend to commit criminal or deviant acts at rates more similar to their biological parents and less similar to their adopted parents. But this could, again, be a result of environment. Sometimes adopted children are treated differently, treated negatively, or labeled differently. And here we've got a breakdown comparing biological and adoptive fathers. Ideally, we could compare a random sample of identical twins who were raised together to a random sample of identical twins who were separated at birth and raised apart. But it's going to be next to impossible to find such a sample, and we're certainly not going to find a large enough sample. But in 1990, Grove compared 32 twins separated at birth, and Heredity seemed to explain 42% of childhood conduct disorder and 28% of adult antisocial personality disorder. That's essentially comparing the same thing. We don't diagnose children. We don't diagnose anyone under the age of 18 with ASPD. They're generally diagnosed with childhood conduct disorder. We do not, however, have any evidence or any research that says there's one gene or even a group of genes that predicts criminal offending. Other research has looked at chromosomes and looked at what's referred to as XYY males. These are males that have an extra Y chromosome. And in the 60s, it was suggested these men were overrepresented in mental institutions and prisons and that they tended to be more violent. More recent studies, however, show there's no link. They do tend to be more energetic and slightly taller, but they're of average intelligence, stable workers. They can father children with no risk. So XYY is not heritable, but it's a genetic abnormality. It's not something you can pass on. Other research has looked at hormones, in particular testosterone, which is a steroid naturally produced by the body. And what that steroid does is regulate the growth of male genitalia and secondary sex characteristics in men. Since men are assumed to be more aggressive than females, researchers have tried to see, does testosterone play a role in a link to criminality? Some researchers have found a connection between testosterone and self-reported aggression in teenage boys. In 1988, study found increased level of testosterone among imprisoned women who were violent. 2001, inmates who had higher levels of testosterone were more likely to have killed an acquaintance and to have planned the action. But we don't know the direction of this link. Does the higher level of testosterone lead to the homicide, or does violence and aggression lead to increased testosterone levels? We also know that our hormone levels have been linked to family support and our living conditions. Adrenaline is another hormone that's often examined. This is epinephrine, and usually when we are under stress, it increases, right? It allows us to kick into that fight or flight response, and it causes cortisol levels to rise. The link here is believed to be negative, that violent individuals may need high levels of stimulation in order to arouse them. So those who commit criminal offenses perhaps have lower levels of adrenaline, and they're engaging in that criminal behavior to increase the adrenaline, to increase their arousal. OWIS found a negative relationship between adrenaline and aggression, and others found that alcohol and testosterone may interact with cortisol, and that may be the actual causal factor. In the past, some people looked at PMS and whether or not estrogen and progesterone levels were linked to women's offending. And in 1961, Dalton studied 156 newly convicted women. He found that 46% had committed their crimes either within 4 days before or 4 days after their menstrual cycle. There's a lot of criticisms of this. First of all, stress influences menstrual cycles. The direction is not clear. These theories about women tend to appear whenever women make strides towards equality. And cycles are also influenced by culture, and symptoms vary by society. More recent research, and this research is a little bit more reliable, I guess, is more biosocial in nature, and it's really examining neurochemicals and neurotransmitters. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that carries information between cells, but it's very difficult to measure because you can only measure it with a spinal tap, which is painful. Moffitt, you might recall Moffitt for some prior classes. Moffitt is the woman who categorized offenders into adolescent limited and life course persistent offenders. She studied 1,000 children in New Zealand from the age of 3 until they turned 21. She found men who had been convicted of violence and those who self-reported violence had higher blood serotonin levels. So one of the things they try to do here is measure serotonin within your blood level, which is obviously not as accurate of a measure. Okay, so what about psychophysiological factors? Psychophysiological measures of arousal include heart rate, skin conductance, and EEG activity. These are the same things that we use in order to test somebody with a quote-unquote lie detector. Rain tells us that these factors are correlated with antisocial and criminal behavior. So again, antisocial individuals, people who are psychotic or have ASPD, are often under-aroused, so they have a lower resting heart rate. And so what happens with people who are often under-aroused is that they engage in risky or adrenaline-producing behavior in order to raise their heart rate. The most replicable findings, so these are the findings that people are able to replicate more often, show a relatively low resting heart rate. So more than twice as many boys with a low heart rate, 65 or fewer beats per minute, were convicted for violence. Rain also studied 15-year-old boys and measured their heart rate along with skin conductance and EEG. And Rain found low heart rate, low skin conductance, and how frequency brainwave activity predicted convictions. This has some similar methodological flaws as in early positivist research. Neuropsychology is the study of how mechanisms that control our behavior localize in certain areas of the brain. So we assume that abstract reasoning, anticipation, planning, and the parts of our brain that inhibit inappropriate behavior are located in the frontal lobe. You might recall we've talked before about the prefrontal cortex and how the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until your early to mid-20s. That's the part of your brain that's responsible for rational decision making. So what might happen if your frontal lobe is not fully developed or that it's been damaged? So there is evidence that damage to the brain can change someone's personality. Lewis found that 90% of 15 murderers that he studied on Florida's death row had suffered some severe head injury. And Rain found that 50% of murderers he studied had brain injuries. Other people have looked at nutrition, although this has largely been debunked. So probably the most famous nutrition-related case we've heard of is the Twinkie defense. And this is sort of interesting because the person to whom this is, attributed actually didn't even eat Twinkies. But Dan White killed 2 public officials in San Francisco in 1978. And so the argument here was that low blood sugar may lead to deviant behavior. Fishbein did find that juvenile offenders placed on a low-sugar diet did reduce their antisocial behavior, but we have 0 definitive evidence on nutrition. Some studies have looked at lead and whether or not it's linked to violent offending. So basically when people consume lead, and this happens, lead was in a lot of types of paint, that this can lead to some violent behavior and it can lead to brain damage. So in 1990, Deno published a study where he followed 987 African-American children from birth to age 22 and found lead poisoning to be one of the better predictors of delinquency. Lead poisoning is also linked to poverty, so it puts certain groups of kids at higher risk. Antisocial personality disorder is the actual diagnosis that we talk about when we tend to talk about psychopathy. And many psychological theories incorporate both biological and sociological explanations. So antisocial personality is a persistent disorder or disability of the mind. And what it does is it results in abnormally aggressive or irresponsible behavior that is not the product of a psychosis or other mental illness. So psychopaths appear normal. They're very charming. Basically, sort of their distinguishing features are that they can lie with ease and that they do not experience empathy. Hare has devised what's called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, and this is what's used to diagnose psychopathy. So things that they look at are a lack of guilt or empathy, manipulation of others, a focus on oneself, minimization of other suffering, shallow affect, grandiose sense of self-worth, low frustration tolerance, persistent norm violations, and high levels of impulsivity. Many serial killers are believed to be psychopaths, but most killers do not have antisocial personality disorder. Most murderers are quote-unquote normal, and recall that the most common circumstance was an argument, so most murders result of an argument that escalates. One thing that research does seem to be showing us is that the brains of psychopathic people may work differently, so they don't respond to emotional words. Sociobiological theories are based on evolutionary theory and the idea that genes are quote-unquote selfish, that creatures adapt and evolve, and as a result, they make choices so that their genes will continue on. So basically, this should predict then that people are less likely to kill people related to them. And a 1988 study found that victims were killed by relatives less than 1/3 of the time. When killed by a relative, it was more likely to be killed by a relative by affinity as opposed to consanguinity. So affinity is a person that you're related to by marriage, as opposed to consanguinity means a blood relative. And that wraps up this chapter on biological and psychological explanations.